and welcome to another one of my design diaries. Today I wanted to talk to you about something more general. I'm kind of running out of things to talk about with Mikeria, and I haven't been able to test Combat Mercenaries yet. So I figured out that maybe today we're going to talk about how I design games or how I approach the design of games. The idea is that this is going to be something specific to me. The methods that I'm going to talk to you about today, which are going to be pretty basic and pretty general, are specific to me. Other people might design their games in a different way, or they might focus on different aspects of it, or they might start from something else. But this is what usually worked for me, so I am hoping that I tell you about this and that if you're a game designer or if you want to start creating board games, you might want to use the advice that I give in this video. Okay, so let's start from the basics. The first thing that you want to do is to have an idea, and that sounds very easy and very obvious, but there are two ways you can go about it, in my experience. It's usually that you come up with an idea for a mechanic first, or you come up with an idea for what the game that you want to create is going to be about, so the theme. Either the mechanics or the theme. Sometimes, very rarely, you'll get an idea for both at the same time and you'll feel that they gel very well. But most of the time, you either have one or the other and you have to figure out the other part of the equation. For me, it's usually the mechanic that comes first, but sometimes I started from having an idea for a theme. For example, with my cooperative game Legend of the Runes, I had the idea for the game after seeing Beowulf in the cinema. So after that, I went home and I made the first notes about the game that I wanted to make, and it wasn't about the mechanics, it was more about what the game is supposed to be. And then you've got games like Mikeria, which started off as being mechanically driven, and then the theme kind of grew with them and was added to them later on, which in case of Mikeria was pretty early on as well. So if you're starting with the theme, the question is what kind of mechanics you have to get inside the game for them to feel adequate to the theme or for them to reinforce the theme. And you'll want to look at certain mechanics in a very thematic way. So if you want to make an economic game, you might want to look into some upkeep rules. So how much does it cost for you to keep your assets on the board, for example? And in that game, you might want to focus on that, but if you're making a battle game, a battle focused game, maybe upkeep isn't as important, and maybe you should first start with some rules about wounding enemies and healing the wounds that you get and that sort of stuff. So it's very important to, even at this very start, know that there are certain mechanics that you don't even have to concern yourself about. The most important thing is that the mechanics fit the theme and reinforce it, because that's what you want to do. You want your game to feel like the theme is very well realized. And sometimes that leads to very specific rules, and other times that's something that you can figure out for yourself. If you find there's some mechanic that you really want to use in that theme, you will usually find a way to somehow make it fit. But some are a better fit than others, and you have to take that into consideration. The most important thing is that the mechanic doesn't feel out of place. So if you're making a game about, say, rampaging orcs and you want to have a bidding mechanic there, you better make sure that the bidding mechanic makes sense in the world. For example, the stuff you bid in, the stuff you bid it with is skulls, or maybe angry orcs that you have under your control, and you bid on certain events with those orcs to see who's the angriest mob or something like that. So the other approach is starting with mechanics. And here the question becomes, if you want to have a theme in the game at the start, which I think is very helpful, is what kind of theme fits those mechanics. So what kind of stuff what kind of story can you tell with those mechanics? For me, it's quite important that a game has a good theme because I feel that it also helps you as a designer figure out what kind of rules are best for your game. And by narrowing this field of your interests, it's quite easy later on to think of new rules or maybe decide to throw a rule away based on the theme. I always feel that it's easiest to design a game when you have the full view because then you know that some stuff is going to be left out and other will make its way in. It's important to find good mechanics for the theme if you're starting with the theme, but if you're starting with the mechanics, theme isn't as important. There are many designers who create games that are very abstract. Rainer Knizia is a great example. He's a guy who does mostly very abstract games which can be rethemed ad infinitum. So you have Battle Line, which initially is about, I think, Greek and Persian armies clashing, but that game can be about pretty much anything because it's just an abstract number game. And the same goes for his Great Wall of China, which in Poland, for example, has been rethemed into a game about standing in queues in the communist era Poland. So the theme usually doesn't mean as much if you start with mechanics, but I still feel like it's good to have it, to have some idea of what the theme could be. Otherwise, you might end up with a pasted on theme, and that's usually less of a fun experience for the players. Depending on this approach, you will end up with much different games. Compare something like Settlers of Catan to something like Battlestar Galactica. One has clearly been focused around mechanics, Settlers of Catan, while the other was about creating a theme, creating a game which is very thematic and does call outs to the TV series all the time. And those are very different games. Okay, so you've got an idea. What's next? Well, I think that it's good and helpful to have an idea of the scope and size of the game. So, do you want it to be a very long, epic game that's going to take 3 hours to play, or do you want it to be a half-hour card game, which is going to be very fast and very kind of silly and fun and goofy? It's important to have this idea right now, though you could argue that it's a bit too early to say whether or not your game is going to be long. But if you have, as a designer, if you have an idea of what you want your game to be, it's going to be easier for you to make the decisions that are going to put it in that direction. If you have a rough idea of how many components there are going to be in the game, so how many decks of cards, for example, you want, or how many characters should be available, and that sort of stuff, if you have a rough idea of that, it might actually help you make decisions later on when you sit down and create the game on paper. And of course, this doesn't need to be exact. That's something that you should understand, that this should be a very rough guess, and that's fine. What you have to know is what kind of experience you want the players to have, because at the end of the day, that's what you are designing, and that's what game design is about. It's about creating something for the players for them to interact with, but that's always going to be somewhat of something of a guided experience. It's always going to be something that you envisioned for them, and that vision is very important from the get-go. You might want to think about the sort of interactions that you want the players to have. Do you want a very competitive game where players are at their throats all the time and they want to win the game by themselves, or maybe you want something with pseudo cooperative elements like some trading or maybe diplomacy or something like that? Or maybe you want to create a cooperative game. Maybe a cooperative game would be the best fit for the kind of ideas that you had for the mechanics and the theme. After you've got that, you should really think about the amount of components. And this is sort of the same thing as thinking about the scope, but this time around you're thinking about specific components that you want to be in the game. So if I'm doing a game about medieval warriors, maybe I want to have a deck of weapons and a deck of armor. Or maybe I want to have different horses as a choice for the players. Maybe I need a big board for the main quest and a small board for a joust subquest or something like that. When you think about those things, they're going to drop into place, and that's a very nice process, and probably my favorite piece of the entire game design process is just thinking about the game and seeing what kind of stuff fits the game and what doesn't. So it's something to consider, as it's going to help you figure out what you want from the game. Before you jump to the final step, I always feel like it's good to let the idea simmer for a week or two, or maybe even a month or longer. As you think about the idea, keep making notes. Note new ideas about the game, or note entire mechanics, because then you might be able to, for example, see that a mechanic doesn't really work, that it has some inherent flaw that needs to be addressed before it's going to work as you intended. It's very easy to forget about certain ideas that you came upon if you don't write them down. I usually nowadays keep a notebook always at hand, because whenever I forget to take one, I always have some good idea, which I'm then afraid that I'm going to forget before I get home. Okay, so that was the idea phase, and that's what in video games is called pre-production. So that's everything you do before you actually get down to it and create the game and create the prototype and test it out. And that's something I'm going to be talking about next week when we delve into the kinds of stuff you should pay attention to when creating a prototype, and the stuff that you shouldn't really worry too much about, and then how to get feedback from your first prototype session or prototype sessions, because there's usually more than one. So that's for next week. This week, that's all from me, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation of mine. If you liked this kind of content, please let me know, because I could focus a few more episodes of the Design Diary on something like this instead of your regular talking about the projects that I'm working on right now. So if you'd like that, please let me know either in the activity feed or send me an email or something. See you around, and thanks for watching.